Richard, or?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Okay, we are live, and here we go. Hi, everyone. This is Mount Greylock High School here with Ethan Zuckerman. I have a little bit of an introduction I want to give, and then we're going to introduce Ethan Zuckerman, who's here from MIT. And then we'll introduce the students really briefly, just by first name, so we know who we're talking to. And then we'll move into a discussion. This is the first part of a series that is part of the DML, the Digital Media and Learning Lab Speaker Series. So this multi-part series concerns how digital media shapes our world and how we shape our world with digital media. We ask questions in these conversations. What is learning in a network society, and how are ideas such as education or communication, community, activism, civics influenced in a digitally connected world? The series hosts conversations with Mount Greylock students, which you see in one of those windows there, and other thought leaders or significant people, notable people in the field of digital media and learning or other. The speakers for this series will be Ethan Zuckerman, who's here with us today, the director of the MIT Center for Civic Media. On Friday, we have Chris Lehmann, who's the founder of the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia and EduCon. And then finally, we'll have Elyse Eidman-Aadahl, who's the director of the National Writing Project. The Mount Greylock DML Speaker Series is made possible by an award from the Olmsted Endowment at Williams College. So today we have here, we have Ethan Zuckerman, and he, as already mentioned, is the director and principal investigator at the MIT Center for Civic Media. And he's also the co-founder of the media community of Global Voices, and I think that he'll probably take some time to explain a little bit about that. Prior to MIT, Ethan worked with the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University on projects focused on civic media, freedom of speech online, and understanding media ecosystems. He also led a team focused on Media Cloud, a project that builds an archive of news stories and blog posts, applies language processing to, and presents ways to analyze and visualize the resulting data. Ethan is also founded something called Geek Corp, which I already told some of the students about, and maybe you talk about that. And you were also involved in Tripod, which is an early internet company in Williamstown. Finally, Ethan travels, as you may or may not know, around the world, Africa, Europe, Asia. More locally, he travels to Cambridge a lot to lead the MIT effort. Despite these far-ranging travels, he's based in Lanesborough with his family. So the students at Mount Greylock, why don't you just raise your hand and just say your first name, and that's pretty good, and then we'll get moving.
I'm Jake.
Hey, Jake.
How's it going? I'm Zach.
I'm Chad.
I'm Julia.
I'm Darian.
I'm Zombie. I'm Nicole. I'm Toby.
Cool. All right, I can actually see everyone in the screen, which is great.
Great. So there are a number of ways we could start these conversations, and I have some questions. I want to define what civics is. I want to understand a little bit more about what cosmopolitan is, and I want to base a lot of our discussion around Rewire, which is your latest book. And of course, we could kind of throw out some anecdotes or some problems that we could investigate. But I guess the starting place I'd like to begin with is with you, Ethan. Is what are you doing right now at MIT, and what is the kind of the driving thesis or force around the MIT Center for Civic Media? And then maybe we can get into some topics, and then hopefully the students will have lots of questions or comments.
Well, so you threw in a bunch of questions there, Richard, but I'll try to grab a couple of them at the same time. So the question of what we're doing at MIT is that my students and I are really interested in what it would mean to be involved with public life in a way other than voting every 2 or 4 years. It seems sort of sadly limited that the main way that we're taught to sort of engage in public life is to show up for an election every 2 years, and really the one that really matters is the presidential one every 4 years. It seems kind of incredibly limited, given the tools we all have at our disposal, to form groups with different people, to talk and debate about ideas, to propose solutions, to try to do things on our own, the idea that we should just be sort of limited to those representative systems seems like a really missed opportunity. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at Center for Civic Media is sort of trying to figure out what does engagement look like by other means. And so engagement could be anything from, the very political, working on a political campaign, to the totally social. So just to give an example, in the recent past, you guys may remember that there was sort of a wave of people on Facebook changing their profile pictures to a pink and red equals symbol. And this was put together by the Human Rights Campaign, which was trying to call attention to a pending decision in the Supreme Court around equal marriage. And the idea behind the campaign was it's a way for people to sort of demonstrate that there may be more people in your circle of friends than you expect who are supportive of equal marriage and who are okay with gays and lesbians marrying. On the one hand, that's pretty far from voting, right? The Supreme Court doesn't count how many people change their pictures on Facebook and sort of say, hey, 3 million, we're gonna decide this case one way or another. On the other hand, it is a way to think about how you make change in the world, because one way you make change in the world is by persuading people to look at something from a different perspective, and having a lot of people sort of get together and say, wow, like half the people I know are supportive of equal marriage, that may have an impact. So we're interested in sort of everything from that really sort of lightweight online activism to petitions to crowdfunding, and we're sort of trying to figure out, particularly around this idea of how do you monitor powerful institutions. So a lot of the work that we do monitors media. It looks at what stories do newspapers report on, what don't they report on, what parts of the world do you hear a lot about, what do you very rarely hear about. And we've just started doing a bunch of work around sort of monitoring government much more directly. And this is work that we're doing in Sao Paulo, the largest city in Brazil, where we're going out into neighborhoods in Sao Paulo with mobile phones and trying to monitor what the infrastructure looks like in a community. And so if the government has said, hey, one of our priorities for the next 4 years is we want to increase the number of streetlights in this city, literally going out and photographing the streetlights so we could have a conversation with the mayor's office and saying, here's a part of town where these aren't going in and where it's really dangerous, or here's a part of town that's really well lit, why are you spending more money there? But it's this whole idea of sort of saying, rather than citizenship being something where you're kind of sitting on the bench for 4 years and then voting at one point, what are different ways that people can sort of get involved day to day, week to week, moment to moment?
I was just thinking about this in terms of, you mentioned crowdfunding. I heard a statistic, I don't know how accurate it is, but the Kickstarter was actually on track to distributing more money to the arts organizations or arts needing individuals and organizations. It's on track to exceeding what the NEA distributed. So,
oh yeah, it actually passed it more than a year ago. Yeah.
So there's an example of
the U.S. coming from those contributions. One of the things we're studying here is something that people call civic crowdfunding. So it's sort of one thing to say, hey, I want to publish a book of photographs, give me $50 and we'll give you a copy of the book when it comes out. And that happens, right? I actually just contributed to a Kickstarter at the Sabbats farm down around Five Corners, where they're trying to raise money to turn their stone barn into a community center. And so I paid $50 for a book of photos, which I hope I will now get a year from now. And that's sort of one way to think about crowdfunding. But people are now doing crowdfunding sort of explicitly around things like, hey, we want to have a community garden here. If we all chip in $20, we can get together and do a work weekend and change this into that space. And that's something that we normally expect governments do, right? You expect to sort of go to the government of town government and say, let's get permission to do this. And instead what's sort of happening is people are raising that money independently and sort of raising it online. It's an interesting, different way to think about how social change is taking place.
I like it. Maybe I can fund my album.
You probably could find your album. Bernice Lewis, singer-songwriter, funded her last album.
Yeah, so good. So that's the work you're doing at MIT. So Rewire, this interesting, I'm trying to capture the argument there in your latest book. And I mean, would it be fair to say that the argument is that despite the connectivity, we may or may not be as connected as we think we are? And I mean, that's very reductive and simplistic, and you get into a lot of examples of how we are super connected to countries around the world and niches, but at the same time, those ecosystems, maybe we're superficially connected, or maybe we're substantively connected, and are we really as kind of becoming as globally connected as we think we are? Is that a fair starting point?
Yeah. So I mean, the argument of the book is pretty simple. When I started getting involved with the internet, which was the early 1990s, so a long time ago at this point, there was this sentiment that the net was going to make the world a much smaller place. And you were going to be interacting with people from all over the world, and we better get used to the notion that these online spaces would be multilingual, and they'd have people from all over the world, and they would be kind of a very different social structure than what we're used to. And that's pretty far from what most of us experience online right now, right? And I mean, I'd be curious to hear what your students sort of think about this, but I often turn to my friend Dana Boyd, who just wrote a terrific book called It's Complicated, about youth and social media. And she said, look, everybody's been afraid of stranger danger on youth and social media, like the notion that basically you're going to go online and meet creepers. And the truth is, what's really happening for most people is that it's a way of extending your existing circle of friends, so that you have an online space as well as an offline space. So the people that you're seeing in the hallways then become the people that you're seeing online. At least it's her argument. And fine, fair enough. Like, that's great, and it's one totally valid way to use these tools. But it's also interesting to think about how would you use these tools to get news or information or have conversations with people in some other parts of the world. And where things get really tricky is that we put a lot of sort of hope and faith that the internet is going to give us these sort of global perspectives. We spend actually a lot less time in newspapers and television news reporting about the rest of the world, because there is this sort of assumption that you could always turn to the internet and have that sort of information. But the truth is, in terms of how most of us actually use the internet, we tend to use it as a local space rather than as a global space. And I sort of go further in the book and kind of make the case that a lot of the tools that have been built, particularly in the last 10 years, and especially Facebook, really put this very heavy emphasis on staying in touch with the people that you already know, and not necessarily much of an emphasis on introducing you to anyone new, and particularly no emphasis on sort of introducing you to someone with whom you might really have a difference of opinion or a different perspective. And so one of the questions that I've sort of asked in all of this is, in some other aspects of society, we think it's pretty healthy for people to be exposed to a diverse set of people. If you guys go on to college, there's a pretty good chance that at a residential college, you're going to end up rooming with someone from a different part of the country, maybe from a different country, maybe of a different race, maybe of a different religion. Most colleges actually consciously choose to do that. They sort of choose and say that part of your experience at college is going to be broadening yourself in one fashion or another. We're going to mix it up whether you like it or not, we're going to take you out of what might have been a more comfortable setting of rooming with someone from Greenfield, and we're going to have you rooming with someone from Ghana. And it's going to be good for you, and that's part of the educational experience. We don't do that online. And it's worth asking the question, should we make some spaces, should we make some tools that try to mix things up, that try to take advantage of this idea that, you know, we're on an internet right now where there's way more Chinese users than there are American users. And for the most part, none of us actually end up interacting with those users or what they think is cool.
I had a question for the students. I'm trying to recall exactly what you were posing there.
Do you want me to turn? You want to ask the question?
Well,
Fair enough.
You mentioned something about you wanted to ask the students about their own experience.
He was asking whether we thought that we used the internet for our own local circles, or we used it to expand our like global knowledge. And I'd say, at least for me, I definitely use it more just to keep in touch with my own friends, and definitely less to know about people who I don't know. Because, I mean, generally, I'm naturally going to care about the people that I know about more than the people who I don't know about. At least for me.
Yeah, the only time really I think I would be on the internet with people that I don't know is probably just Reddit.
Yeah.
Other than that.
And Reddit is an interesting space, right? Because, like, on the one hand, it is a really interesting space of sort of mixing people. You don't know where they're from, you don't know where they're coming from. On the other hand, it has some real demographic biases, right? It's mostly men, it's mostly young men, it's mostly geeky young men. So, you know, but it is definitely sort of moving out of the realm of people you know directly and sort of into. I mean, Reddit's kind of cool in that it's actually a somewhat more old-fashioned internet thing. Back in the old days when the internet was new, you know, most of the people that you knew were not online. And so what would happen is you would go online to something like Usenet, which tended to be organized by topics. And so if you were into photography, you would hang out with other people who were into photography. Whether they were in Finland or Japan or the United States, like that's who you were sort of hanging out with at that point. And a lot of these models of sort of like all your friends are online, and you can spend all of your time Instagramming your lunch and sending it back and forth. That's actually a much newer model of what we use the net for. Whereas in some ways, Reddit is actually, you know, much closer to this model of 20 or 30 years ago of get psyched about a topic and sort of come in and hang out with other people who are playing the same game that you're playing.
I just have a quick question. You talked before about the work that you're doing with your MIT students and about using technology to get more of a say in government and in the public. And I was curious what you guys had talked about using that data for, because I'd imagine that most of the people who respond are going to be people who have technology, people who have specific access, and then also the people who care more or less about a topic. So it seems like you'd always have sort of skewed data in terms of knowing what to do with it.
So you put forward two assumptions, and one of them turns out to be right, and then one of them turns out to be less right. We are not like showing up in Sao Paulo and essentially saying, hey, if you read this webpage, you know, come participate in this project. What we're actually doing is sort of going out into very specific communities and working with existing community groups. And then sort of saying, you know, what are the issues that your community cares about? And so you're absolutely getting people who are already community activists, right? You're getting the sort of people who will show up for a community meeting. What's interesting is you don't necessarily get people who you would think of as being highly technical or highly technically knowledgeable. So we were down doing this work. We were walking around a favela, a slum, called Santa Lucia. And we were talking with people in this community about, you know, what they cared about, what they were worried about in their community. And someone who was already working in that community said, look, we're really worried about public safety. This community's on a really steep hill. Rather than roads, we pretty much have staircases. The staircases don't have handrails. We've got elderly people, they fall, they break limbs. And then immediately this guy is sort of telling us this, whips out his phone and starts, paging through his photos that he's taken of these sort of dangerous places. And so it was really interesting for us to sort of realize that, we're in a community where the average income is 2,000 US dollars a year. The guy that we're talking to is a former drug dealer who was incarcerated and has now become a community activist. And he's walking around with a knockoff $40 Samsung smartphone and already using sort of photographs on the smartphone to document problems in the community. So all we're really doing is going another step and essentially saying, that's great. Let's help you send those to a web server. Let's put them on a map. Let's get a map of those staircases in this community, and then let's sit down with the mayor's office and say, look, we've mapped the dangerous parts of our community. We've mapped the areas where we need some help. We now have a conversation about how we work with the city of Sao Paulo to move things forward. So you're talking about sort of two questions of self-selection. Who selects in terms of knowledge of community affairs? At any time you do community activism, you're going to self-select for your most knowledgeable, most engaged people. But then the second one is sort of what we tend to call the digital divide question. And 10 years ago, we would have said, this is impossible. The only people who can participate in this are people who have access to a computer, who are knowledgeable about computers. And that turns out just to be the wrong set of assumptions these days. These days, in a lot of the countries that I work in, including the sub-Saharan African ones, people are very, very likely to have a smartphone, even if it's a smartphone very different from what we're carrying, and are very, very likely to be able to use it to do things like document problems in the community. And that's been a huge surprise for us as well. We've gone out sort of with the assumptions that we'd have to go and donate phones to these communities, and everyone was sort of like, no, actually I like my phone better. Keep your phone. Thank you very much.
Nice.
Good. I have a series of questions, and I think I might just throw out a couple of those. There's one, at the end of the book you said that there's an opportunity regarding being connected, and of course we're an educational institution, we're a high school, so you said, what does it mean for education, or actually I was asking the question, what does it mean for education and learning to be so connected? Because you mentioned something about putting the connected world at the center of the curriculum. In other words, there are all these experiences internationally and these different communities and ecosystems. And how do we put that, all those rich possibilities at the center of the curriculum? I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit about how we, just your Joe average high school, could possibly implement that, depending on what you mean that is.
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of what I'm arguing in the book is that we are incredibly connected economically to the rest of the world. We get a lot of our stuff from the rest of the world. We're not necessarily all that knowledgeable about what's going on in the rest of the world. And that this is a really weird moment. When we're at a moment where our electronics are made in China and our clothing is made in Bangladesh, and we're honestly not getting very much visibility on sort of what's going on in terms of current events or a sense of what local attitudes are, what political issues are. It's a really strange moment. We're really dependent on a lot of these relationships, but we're also not particularly knowledgeable about these relationships. One of my favorite exercises around this actually comes from a piece that showed at Mass MoCA like 8 or 9 years ago now. But it was a really simple exhibit. It was a global map, and it had a bunch of push pins on it, and it had a pair of scissors. And the instructions were, reach into the back of your shirt, figure out the label, and see where it says your piece of clothing was made. Cut out the label, put it on the map. And it's pretty interesting. You actually end up sort of discovering that the global garment trade is actually pretty global. There's a decent chance that if any of you are wearing jeans, I'm wearing jeans today, they're made in Lesotho. And Lesotho just happens to be a small African state that managed to take advantage of certain trade restrictions to kind of corner the market in the region. And so there's a decent chance that you're going to find the Lesotho tag there. Bangladesh has sort of built a massive garment business, which has actually had some real tragedy. And you guys may remember that there was a garment factory that collapsed, killing hundreds of people. So what we'll do is we'll be to basically say, look, where in the world are you wearing? Like, just go over for the course of a week and figure out how many countries you end up implicitly sort of representing in your clothing. Cluster them, figure out like the 5 countries that turn out to dominate. You know, it's going to be Bangladesh, Vietnam, possibly Colombia. There'll be a couple of others. And then, you know, try to find someone who works in the garment industry in that country. You know, can you find someone on Facebook? Like, can you, you know, actually befriend someone and sort of make that connection? You know, it's a way of using the technology that you actually have direct access to, but using it in a sort of a radically different fashion. I have no idea what will happen if you start randomly emailing people in Vietnam via Facebook. It would actually be pretty interesting to sort of say, you know, my school's doing a project. We discovered that a good chunk of our clothing is made in Vietnam. I'm trying to find someone in Vietnam who's on Facebook and also who works in the garment industry. Can you help me find some? It would be interesting to see, you know, whether you could actually make those connections, and then, you know, whether there's a conversation to be had once you sort of get in touch.
So what's the end goal of, I mean, guaranteed if you have a more connected world, it'll be great to have like increased awareness. Do you think that increased awareness will help create like a more peaceful society in general, or help governments run more smoothly, or what's the end result?
Yeah, so I've got 3 reasons why I think this is worth doing. And reason 1 is kind of in the feel-good space that you just talked about. You know, yeah, maybe we'll have a better chance of addressing global warming if you're actually talking to people in other countries. The less pretty version of the feel-good is the next time you have bird flu or SARS or some sort of epidemic, you're going to discover that you actually do need people interacting with each other across borders to try to figure out a way to make some progress. So that's the first one. The second one is that, particularly for your generation, if you want to figure out how to make money, you're going to have to start looking at some of these other markets and some of these other countries and trying to figure out how business culture changes in those places. I work on the internet. Pretty much the US is on the internet. You're not going to get any more people on there. And it's becoming something of a zero-sum game. If I start my new social networking application, I got to get you to spend less time on Facebook or Twitter and more time on whatever the heck I'm doing. But India is coming online in a huge way. Brazil is coming online in a huge way. China is utterly massive. And actually, Chinese internet companies, in a lot of cases, are just a ton more interesting than what's going on in the United States. I find WeChat and Weibo much more interesting than sort of anything that people use in the States. And so a lot of the interesting ideas are coming out of there. So there are new ideas and markets that are coming out. The third reason, and what a lot of the book is actually about this idea that groups of people who have a high degree of diversity tend to solve problems better. That when you take a bunch of people who come from very different backgrounds, they usually don't like working together very much, but they quite often come up with significantly better solutions than groups of people who sort of think the same way. You may have heard of ideas like groupthink, where you get a lot of people who have this sort of strong incentive to say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, that's a good way to do things. It's really nice to have access, either in a circle of people, or from your own experience, looking at things from different points of view, to have access to cognitive diversity. And so you can get cognitive diversity by having a really diverse social circle and sort of turning to people from different backgrounds. You also may be able to get it from having a sense of how a problem, a world event, looks like from multiple points of view. So yeah, absolutely. All the feel-good kumbaya stuff that you're referring to is one camp. Getting paid is the second camp, and I would say, you know, being smarter and being able to sort of approach things from multiple perspectives is the third camp. But as you're sort of politely pointing to, it's a tough sell, and this is one of the things that's actually been kind of tough with this book is that it's kind of telling people to eat your vegetables. You know, hey, wouldn't it be great if you used the internet to hang out with people other than you normally hang out with? And everyone sort of has the best intentions and sort of says, yeah, that would be fun. Let me remember how to do that after I do the next thing. I'm actually really interested in whether we can build tools that are fun and useful and interesting and also sort of push the boundaries for you on this. And that's what some of my students are involved with. One of my students has been working on a project this year called Terra Incognita. So the unknown lands, the part of the globe that isn't mapped out. And this is just a little browser extension. It just sits in your web browser. When you go to a news site, it basically checks off what parts of the world you're reading about. And so you can pull up a map and sort of see where you've read about. But it also tries to push you towards interesting and different content in places you haven't read about. So I read a lot about North America. I read a lot about Africa. I don't read very much about South America. When I open a new tab in this browser, it picks the city in South America, throws up a map of it, and sort of suggests something that I might want to read about. And if I have an extra moment and I'm sort of bored, it suddenly becomes this prompt to say, can you get some information? Can you get exposed to something you didn't expect to be exposed to? We're really interested in this question of, can we make this sort of more fun? Can we make this less about eating your vegetables and sort of more about, it's just something that happens in the course of your time online?
Even if I wanted to like hang out with someone from China, I don't speak any Mandarin, so how would I do that?
Google Translate.
I know.
You've got a surprising number of English speakers over there, and some you can find around certain communities. So there's a huge community of people who subtitle shows from English into Chinese. And so these are, so Game of Thrones premiered last night, right? And like some of you, I'm trying to download it today because I didn't get to see it on HBO. But there are teams in China downloading that first episode, transcribing it in English, translating it into Chinese, and putting the Chinese version online. And there are teams that take every anime that comes out of Japan and work together to translate it from Japanese and into English. If you wanted to hang out with Chinese people who are working on their English, those become interesting communities that you could find ways to get into. That's kind of a high degree of difficulty. If you're looking for a lower degree of difficulty, there are really good sites out there that are talking about what's going on the Chinese internet. Something like China Smack, something like TV Nation. And those often have communities of people in China who speak really good English, who are really interested in kind of sharing what's going on in that country and sort of going further with them. But that's very much what this site, Global Voices, that we've been working on for the last 10 years now, is sort of all about. It's basically people from all over the world writing about what's going on in their countries, what's going on in the internet in their countries, in English for a global audience, so that they can kind of be a pathway into those conversations. So it doesn't have to be as sort of absurd as like, let me find someone who I have no common language with, and let's see if we can have a conversation. There's actually a bunch of people essentially saying, no, we've got some English, may not be as perfect as you'd like it to be, but let's start, and let's start having sort of a dialogue from there. And those are a couple of pathways in. There's also even chat systems that try to go after something as hard as, let's have a chat with someone that we have no language in common with. There's a system called Midan, which has been trying for years to get people in English and Arabic talking with one another. And they use automated translation, and basically they have people talking about news stories from the Middle East. And so it gets posted in one language, gets translated automatically. You can chat or comment back and forth, and it does machine translation, and then it also asks you to clean up the translation. So you may not speak Arabic, but you can see the translation in English, and you can go, oh, whoa, that's not good English. Let me clean that up. I think I understand what the person means. And that becomes sort of a joint project around it. So there's a bunch of stuff going on around it. It kind of depends on what you're most interested in. The big thing I would say, if you're serious about it, is it's actually most likely to happen around an interest you already have. Yeah. So, you know, if you're into NBA basketball, there are definitely chat rooms that are involving overseas Chinese, mainland Chinese, non-Chinese, talking about basketball from a Chinese perspective. And that may be a pathway in if you're interested both in talking about hoops and also talking about China. But that sort of experience of like, I'd love to know more about Japan, finding a Japanese person to talk to almost never works. What works surprisingly well is I'm really interested in what's going on in this manga. Can I find a community that's part Japanese speaking, part English speaking? And is there a role for me in that community to become part of a larger project?
That's great. We have about 8 minutes.
Yes.
So I wanted to make sure that some of the other students, if they had questions, could pose some questions or make some comments.
I have a question. So this proposal that you have for communicating with people that you don't know, do you think it could be something that might be useful within the United States? Because I know that there's people who might friend me on Facebook, and the first thing I would look at is mutual friends and how many of my friends they've been friends with, so I know he's not a creeper or something, he or she. And so I'm wondering if you think that your goals and your ideas could be applied to the U.S. to maybe like make more communication within our country.
Yeah, I absolutely think you could do this on local scales, you could do this on national scales, you could do this on international scales. I actually think kind of the same principles apply. So I think, you know, if we randomly say, you know, hey, you're from New England, let me find you a Texan to talk with, you know, it's sort of as lame as pen pals, you know, as a system, right? Like, it's great if you manage to find a friendship, but there's sort of no guarantee of it. What I think is potentially far more interesting is if you are interested in a particular topic, and there's a way to sort of introduce you not just to people locally who are interested in that, but people who might be somewhere else in the United States, and sort of have the possibility of having one thing in common, but actually one thing that's very different. You know, I would say this happens a lot when you have just sort of arbitrary connections in one fashion or another. And an example, you know, this is not encouragement, but when my wife got pregnant, she ended up hanging out on LiveJournal with people who were due in the same month that she was. And she's a rabbi in North Adams. And she found herself hanging out with more Christians from the Deep South than she probably ever is likely to in her entire life. And it was very interesting for her in that it was definitely exposure to ways of looking at the world that she doesn't necessarily get a lot of in her daily life. But they also have the common ground of they were in the same points in their pregnancy, they're in the same points in their child raising, so it becomes kind of a common ground that you can build on at the same time. So I'm not saying anything as naive as pick someone else in the rest of the world and build a friendship. You know, that sounds great, but you know, it's really, really hard to do. It's more a question of, with Facebook, we built this tool that is so good at saying, how do I stay in touch with the people that we already know? Is there room, are there other subjects where it would be helpful to sort of say, here's one thing we have in common, here's a lot of things we don't have in common, and let's figure out how to talk, you know, how to bond over what we have in common and also talk about what's different.
Okay.
So, wait, how much time do we have left, Mr. Scullin? 5? Okay. Okay.
There's a hand up behind you as well.
Okay, so one last question, at least that I had, is, so I've heard of, for example, I'm a big fan of the site Duolingo, which kind of uses its double purpose, like translates web pages, but also helps people learn how to speak a language as well. Do you think that there's still a number of services that still have yet to be made using that same sort of both service and like company-oriented appeal, I guess?
Yeah, so Duolingo is really cool, and what it tries to do, remember I said before that even if you don't speak Arabic, you might be able to look at an Arabic-English translation and say, that's messed up, let me fix that up. That's kind of how Duolingo works. You may not speak a ton of Spanish, like I speak like 3 years of high school Spanish, but I can kind of look at a text and sort of say, that's not a good translation, let me clean that up into better Spanish. And that's what Duolingo is basically doing. It's trying to teach you a language while have you cleaning up machine translation. And so it's a really interesting hack, right? Because it's basically using you as free labor and then sort of rewarding you by paying you off the language lessons. And it's pretty cool. The guy who did it is a guy named Elyse Eidman-Aadahl, who's a really brilliant computer scientist. And the first thing that he figured out to do were these things called CAPTCHAs, where when you're trying to log onto a site for the first time, it gives you sort of distorted text. When you're typing in that text, you're actually helping scan books. So that hack of both like teaching you a language and getting labor out of you, or like getting you to scan a book as well as to sign up for a website, really tough, really awesome when you can do it. I would say I think the internet is going to change language learning pretty radically. One of my students here is working on a system based around Google Glass. And so imagine for the moment that, you know, he happens to be Indian, he's walking around Calcutta, and you can see what he's seeing and point to it on your screen and say, Daria, what's the word for that in Hindi? And he can say, oh, I'll tell you the word in Hindi. Actually, let me bring you over to the shopkeeper and show you how to buy it in Hindi, and sort of give you that contextual language lesson where you're able to sort of guide him around the screen. So we're in really early stages of that, but it looks like a really compelling system for basically sort of putting you in a very different experience of learning a language. You're basically walking around a city with someone asking how to say the things rather than sort of looking at them from the schoolbook perspective.
But that's...
How about one more question? Someone else had their hand up in the back.
Alright, I have a question. So earlier you were talking about how like your students and your project is bringing cell phones to like developing countries, having them work on issues with their governments and things. How else are you working with mobile phones in developing countries to help them develop, I guess?
Yeah, so to be really clear, actually, we don't focus on bringing the mobile phones into other countries because it's actually really easy to get mobile phones these days in most of the countries that I work with, including very, very poor countries. What we're often working on are how can you use those mobile phones to sort of document problems in the community. So can you use those mobile phones to make good maps of your community? In a lot of cases, communities don't have an accurate map. And it's actually really, really hard to sort of have a conversation about public services if you can't put them on a map. It's a really powerful tool for sort of saying, here are problems in the community that I want the government to address, and then sort of putting them in front of the government. And then it's also a really powerful tool for sort of organizing. Almost all the folks we work with in Brazil use Facebook from their mobile phones as their main organizing tool to try to get people to sort of go out in their communities. So it's really like the dominant platform we end up using to try to figure out how to get people talking together about issues in their community.
Okay.
I had a question. Sorry for coming late, by the way. I was able to read your book, Rewire. I thought it was a really nice novel. I just want to talk about your theory of flock together, where people like connect while disconnecting to other people, and how like xenophiles are able to connect to other people that they really have an interest in. So I just want to know how we could connect to other people in that same manner without excluding others.
Yeah. So what the gentleman's talking about is one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is this tendency of birds of a feather to flock together. If you know a lot of people from Western Mass and you suddenly find yourself at college in Iowa, you may instinctively, whether you know it or not, like find the other people from Western Mass or find the other people from like rural New England. And it's just a very human tendency to sort of pay attention to those who you already know, who you always know to be important. one of the things that I talk about is what I'm calling bridge figures, who are people who can sort of build a bridge between two different communities. So this might be someone who, say, lived and worked in Africa, but also lived and worked in Mass, and who knows a little bit about the two communities and can sort of bring the two together. I think the net makes it possible for bridge figures to do really interesting things, to connect people in really unexpected ways. What the gentleman was saying was, I also speculate that there's a group of folks called xenophiles. And these are people who seek inspiration from different parts of the world. And when you're looking for information, when you're looking for connections from different parts of the world, I think the key to this is to go with what you know and what you're interested in. I spend a lot of time listening to music from around the world. When I'm going to a country for the first time, the first thing I do is start downloading music from that country so that I know what records I'm going to buy when I'm over there. If you're into food, if you're into movies, I mean, those become really interesting ways to connect to the people and the communities in those other countries who are interested in some of the same things that you are, but are also looking at it from a different cultural context. And so that's very much sort of the recipe that I try to give for people looking to use the net, not just to connect to the people that you already know, but to connect to other people.
That's great. Well, I think we should wrap up and respect your time. And students from Mount Greylock, thanks a lot for participating and asking some really good questions and hanging out with Ethan. And Ethan, thank you very much. It's just a kind of a toe in the water and kind of touching on a bunch of good topics that I think that we have to work on. But this is the next generation of thinkers and intellects who will be kind of learning in these realms. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? And I think your book starts to take the steps toward making those progress. I think I was trying to remember the quote that you had from the rabbi at the second last sentence of the book. I left it on the table in the other room, but it's something.
Not incumbent to us to finish the work, but it is incumbent upon us to start it. Yeah, it's too big a problem for anybody to solve on your own, but it's probably also too big a one to ignore. Guys, really a pleasure. Nice to meet everybody. And
thanks so much.
Yeah,
guys. See ya.
Thank you.